trying to get people in here, I will go ahead and introduce our keynote speaker. Marisa Miakonda Cummings of the Omaha tribe of Nebraska is dedicated to Indigenous models of governance, education, food systems, birthing ceremonies, and sovereignty. She studies and teaches knowledge rooted in matriarchy and advocates for dismantling systems of oppression that impact our Native communities, including resource extraction and personal violence. Marisa has worked across the U.S. to consult on culturally specific healing practices and intentional and systemic equity regarding American Indian populations. She trains on the impact of federal Indian policy on American Indian people and the relationship between historical trauma and contemporary challenges in our families and communities. She holds a Bachelor's of Arts degree in American Studies from the University of Iowa and a certificate in American Indian Native Studies, as well as a minor in African American World Studies. She earned her master's degree in tribal administration and governance from the University of Minnesota Duluth. She has over 12 years of experience in higher education. She has served her people as a CEO of the Omaha tribe and most recently served as the president and CEO of the Minnesota Indian Women Resources Center in Minneapolis, Minnesota. She was born in Winnebago, Nebraska, and raised in Sioux City, Iowa. She belongs to the Buffalo Tail clan of the Sky People, as well as the Walker and Springer families, and the eldest of 8 children. She is the mother of 4 adult children and grandmother to 1 grandson. And she enjoys teaching traditional food practices and spaces where culture and traditional ways are alive and thriving. Thank you very much. Let's give Marisa a big round of applause for coming all the way here to Tucson, Arizona, to give this talk. Thank you, Marisa.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Okay. Thank you for coming back to lunch to hear this presentation. I want to start out with the introduction in my language. So, Ambate uda wangale latite uda. Omaha ijaje wibita te Miakonda, te sindawa ubli, ishta sunda nikashingawa ubli. So what I just said is it's a good day today, and I'm glad that each and every one of you are here. My name is Marisa Cummings, that's my English name. My Omaha name is Miakonda, and as was stated in my bio, I am Omaha and belong to the Buffalo Tail clan. And you heard a lot about my background and the things that I have done and continue to enjoy doing, rooted in our traditional ways of being. And yet I'm also here representing the Administration for Native Americans and the Administration for Children and Families today. We're going to go over a few things. I serve right now as a senior advisor to the Administration for Children and Family as an MMIP subject matter expert. And we'll go over the missing and murdered Indigenous peoples crisis and how it relates to social determinants of health, vulnerabilities, for Native people, and I use the word vulnerabilities because these are systemic vulnerabilities that have been created that put us in positions where we may experience violence. Protective factors, ACF, MMIP action plan, which we have in full effect right now, and the Not Invisible Act Commission, which I served as an alternate on. So we'll do a brief overview. So in terms of the Administration for Children and Families and those that we serve, which also include people that are Indigenous to the Pacific Island, as well as American Indians and then Alaska Natives. And so when we use this phrase, MMIP, we're referring to the population that includes American Indians, Alaska Natives, Native Hawaiians, and the Indigenous peoples of Guam, American Samoa, and the Northern Mariana Islands, who have all been victims of violence, homicide, human trafficking, and sexual exploitation. And we'll talk more about how this interfaces with generational harm as well. Social determinants of health. How many of you have heard of this term, social determinants of health? Okay, about half of you. So social determinants of health affect an individual's functioning, quality of life, patterns of social engagement, and a sense of security and well-being. So essentially, social determinants of health are what we're born into in our families. They're the housing that we live in or we come home to as babies from the hospital. They are the dynamics of our family unit that we're born into. And they also include the health care that we have access to, the foods that we eat, and access to education and workforce opportunities. So when you think of our population of American Indian people, we have to look at how federal policy has impacted the lives and well-being of our people at that very foundational level. So, and I give some examples of social determinants of health and health outcomes. Vulnerability factors that lead to MMIP. So one thing that I say often is that our people are not deficit-based. Our people, there's nothing wrong with our people. We hear that a lot. Well, you have the highest rates of this and the highest rates of that and the highest, yes, that's true. We're on the highest disparities of everything, but we weren't always that way. We had our own forms of government. We had our own forms of healthcare systems. We had our midwives and our women that delivered our babies so that we didn't have the highest maternal and infant mortality rate in the country. We had systems that were in place that worked for us, and those were intentionally and systematically dismantled in order for us not to survive. And we know that. We heard that a lot today, and I know this presentation intersects with a lot of other things that you heard. And so what the place that we're at today as Indian people is we have people that have been exposed generationally to trauma. So there's both the historical trauma and then concurrent trauma. So the trauma hasn't stopped. It's still happening in our families. We have children in the foster care system or children who've aged out of the system and have nowhere to go. We also have children who've been in the foster care system generationally. We're looking at sometimes second, third, fourth generation of children who've been in the child welfare system. We have runaway and homeless youth and homeless families and adults, those who've experienced physical or intellectual disabilities, those with mental and substance use disorders, and those who've been victims of violence, but also those who've been exposed to violence. And you heard that earlier about what it feels like to be a young man to watch that violence happen in your home. And then those that are victims of prejudice and racism. These all create vulnerability factors and impact vulnerability factors, and oftentimes they're compacted. So we know this, and this hurts to hear. Many of us are thinking about our own families, what it looks like within our own brothers, sisters, parents, grandparents, but also what are those protective factors that are innately woven and braided into our kinship systems and our cultural systems. And this is a picture of my grandson. He's the first one. So he's what we call a shuwi. He's the first son of this line of children in our family. And I was so happy that he was coming into the world. And I was able to help deliver him with my daughter. Sorry, getting emotional. She's about to have another one too, so I'm gonna have 2 grandkids. But I think about when I had her, I almost died in childbirth. And so seeing her go through labor and having the process be so beautiful and having him brought into the world in such a good way, it was just, to me, that was healing. Watching that she didn't have to endure what I had to endure when I had children. And so we look at how culture, he was named on his 4th morning. He was introduced to all of creation with his Indian name. And our family came together and we feasted. And that's the first time that's happened in our family in 2 generations. We were all named on the 4th day, but it was more done in secret or in quiet. He was openly named, and even our sacred items were laid out to be introduced to him. So to me, that's healing. That's what our healing looks like. So when we talk about culture, language, traditional practices, and even kinship, the way that our kinship systems work is not the way the Western kinship systems work. When I lost my parents in my 30s, I had my aunties step up who would actually be like my dad's second cousins. I think that's how that translates, but they stood up as my moms. And I always have somewhere to go. I always have somewhere that's home. And I'm really thankful and blessed that I have that, but that's because our family practices those kinship systems. I was talking earlier, when my father was born, we don't know who my father's dad was. He was never around him. And so when my grandmother came out of Haskell Indian boarding school, she was placed in Sioux City, about 20 minutes from our reservation. And my dad was raised with all of her family. All of his auntie moms and uncles raised him. And so he didn't have a clan because we go through the paternal line. And so my great-grandfather, my grandmother's father, named him and adopted him into our clan. And so those are the ways that our kinship maintains, and that we're inclusive, and that we love people and bring them into our families with that type of love that I know some of you know about. It's something we feel from our grandmas, our aunties, our moms, and our uncles and fathers as well, and grandfathers. So we talked about the vulnerabilities, we talked about social determinants of health and what can lead to MMIP, and then we talked a little bit about protective factors and how we build on these protective factors, which I heard earlier some young ladies talk very beautifully about what they're doing in their community. That's all protective factors that you heard them talk about. And they didn't even have to use that word. They were just talking about the beautiful work that they're doing in their community with equine therapy and other things. And then we get into the federal level, what's happening. And so I wanted to share some of the things that we're doing, because I know I was an administrator for my tribe. So I ran all of our tribal programs as a tribal administrator. And I sat on the other side of the table with federal officials, and I was saying, they, them, what are you doing? Why aren't you doing enough? All of those things that I know people feel. And so I wanted to talk about what we are doing. And I wanted to talk about it in a way that hopefully makes sense, but I also want you to feel open to asking questions at the end, because I really want to leave room for questions, because I feel like real learning happens through dialogue and exchange and not just people being talked at. So in 2020, ACF developed what's called the Missing and Murdered American Indians Framework for Action. So this is all available online, and you can link on this presentation. As you can see, they're hyperlinked. So that framework was the first time that it was looked at, this crisis of MMIP, what we call now, as a public health crisis. So we looked at those public health factors. Like, why is this happening? Jurisdictional issues. There's other federal agencies that work with that, with law enforcement jurisdiction. We work in health and human services. So we're the HHS umbrella. And within that is public health, mental and behavioral health as well. And so in 2020, this conversation started happening along with our Tribal Advisory Committee, which is comprised of tribal leaders in their communities that help inform this process. And then Executive Order 14053 came out, and you can read the long title there, but essentially it was a very detailed executive order on how we're going to address this crisis from President Biden. And then in 2023, ACF TAC requested additional resources. So I was brought on as an MMIP subject matter expert and to assist in writing this MMIP action plan, which is a very detailed document that incorporates equity, self-governance, Indigenous knowledge, as well as program enhancements such as leveraging grant funding and opportunities, and rulemaking authority. So rulemaking authority is when the federal government says, we mandate this happens for ACF, this ACF program, and then it comes down the program line to the services that you receive. So recently there was a rule that was made about anyone that now has foster children foster children that identify as LGBTQI, Two-Spirit, has to go through a training on how to take care of those children in a way that's meaningful for those children. So that's a rule. So that means that anyone who receives child welfare funds, including our tribal programs, has to make sure that they're doing that. So if that makes any sense. And you can find all these rules online, not that you would ever want to search them, but they're all online. And then in November of 2023, the NIAC final report was submitted. So the NIAC, I'll talk more about what that commission is, but DOJ and DOI were then required to submit a response to that report. And that happened in March of 2024. And I'll talk more about what that looks like. But first I'm going to tell you about the map, because this is something that I know I feel very passionate about, because this is basically all of ACF programs need to now look at this and see how they're implementing the pieces of this map into their programs and services. So what does it do? The map advances the whole of government commitment to addressing the crisis of MMIP and sets out a multi-pronged approach to advance ACF's work in preventing violence to people, Native people, and promoting healing from historical trauma. So we acknowledge that healing from historical trauma is something that we need to work on. For generations, Indigenous people and Native communities have struggled with high rates of violence and trauma caused by the devastating legacy of assimilationist policies of forced removal, boarding school trauma, and bureaucratic oppression. So we acknowledge this. To counter the cumulative impacts of historical trauma, ACF will prioritize working in partnership with Native communities using its grant funding and technical assistance resources, as well as rulemaking authority where appropriate. So basically, we're going to look at how we're administering our grant funding, how we're supporting those that receive grants, and then where we need to make those changes with the rules internally. And then we also recognize that enduring change must be grounded in culture and self-governance. So if you know anything about federal Indian policy and law, self-governance was not always a thing. Self-determination was not always a thing until the 1970s. It was actually assimilationist policies. It was policies of termination. It was policies that harmed our communities for a very long time. And in the 70s, that started to shift towards self-governance, which means that each tribal nation has the ability to define themselves and to use tribal program funding in a way that supports their community. So that was the beginning of the culturally based funding that we're talking about, or the culturally based use of funding. So we know that Native culture is steeped with traditional knowledge and holistic health practices, such as ceremony, and that can look different in every community, but it can be sweat lodges, talking circles, language, or community gatherings. Traditional lifeways promote collective governance and accountability processes to minimize violence. So if you think of any time that your community gathers, so it could be to harvest corn for certain clans, it could be to gather for a dance or a ceremony, and think of how people are interacting with each other in a way that those people might not even like each other outside of that specific space, but at that time and during that time, they're interacting with each other as they're supposed to in kinship relationship with one another. And so we know that those traditional lifeways also enforce accountability processes that we already had. And you heard a little bit earlier people talking about, what we've adopted from colonial ideologies and what we've accepted in some spaces as colonial ideology. And then also, but we've kept a lot too. And if we sit down at the table and listen to your grandmas and you listen to your grandpas talk, you'll find out that we've kept a lot. And so we need to look at what we've kept and make sure that we're continuing to tell those stories, even if those stories conflict the majority. When I was growing up, my dad was my hero. My dad was the most amazing person in the world to me. He was first generation to go to college. He used to pack meat during the nights, lug meat at the beef plant, and then he'd go to school all day. He got his master's degree in public relations and did a lot of economic development work with my tribe. But he was just my hero. He was my dad. And he would take us out, into the woods, and we always knew when he was calling us back because he did this whippoorwill thing with his hands that I keep hearing him out here too, so I always think he's with me when I hear them. But he used to sit down and tell me, or he would sit in the chair and he'd have me sit in front of him. And it was almost like he was drilling into my head almost nightly that what my responsibility was to be in my life moving forward. And he would say things like, they're gonna tell you that women can't speak up in front. They're gonna tell you that women weren't medicine women. They're gonna tell you, and he would say all these things, and all the things that he said has happened. Everything he told me was going to happen to me has happened. But because he told me that was okay, and he told me how in our family line what that looked like, he gave me that permission to be my full self. And because he gave me that permission to be my full self, it gave me courage to be in spaces where I've had to speak out against leadership, or I've had to speak out against harmful practices. And so that's when we talk about silence. I heard that a little bit ago about how silence is where this lives. Many of us knew that our grandparents went to boarding school. We knew great-grandparents did, but you never talked about it. You could never go ask, what happened in boarding school? That would be hurtful, harmful, insulting to your grandparents to say something like that. And so that silence was just kept for a really long time in a lot of families, and sometimes it still is. But we know that the pathway to healing the trauma that our family lines have gone through and preventing more violence for the next generation is through culture, and culture is prevention. And so you see this model here, this diagram that shows there's 4 public health pillars of prevention, intervention, healing, and response. And they're all intersect not only with one another, but they intersect with our cultural values at the very core of who we are. And the pathway to healing trauma and preventing more violence is culture. As I said, culture is prevention. And so these are items that ACF has vowed to do, which is one, we recognize that community partners and grant recipients, and I realized, oh, no, they aren't the same. I was like, did I just duplicate? But they're not duplicated. So basically, we know that tribes or tribal partners that receive grants, they know how to administer those grants. They know how to work with their communities best. And so we have to make sure that we aren't overburdening them with administrative practices or bureaucracy that makes them spend more time doing reports than doing the work in the community. So that's something that we've acknowledged. And that's also through an executive order that came out, 14112. So those are some of the things that we're doing. These are all of the ways that there's a whole of government approach, and there's more than this, but this is just in my world, of collective legislative and policy actions to addressing the crisis. So we had the Not Invisible Act Commission, which I'll talk about shortly. We've had the framework that I just talked about. There's the Federal Boarding School Initiative that was initiated by then Congresswoman Deb Haaland, who is now our Madam Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland. We have the President Biden's Executive Order 14053. There was also guidance that was issued by President Biden in the White House telling federal departments and agencies how they should be incorporating Indigenous knowledge and practices and supporting that within their programming. And then there's the action plan that I had just talked about. So the Not Invisible Act Commission, how many of you have heard of it, or NIAC as it's called? Okay, just a few. Okay, well, this is really important. This commission had to do, I'm going to break this down really simple. So Congress enacted the Not Invisible Act, and it had the purpose of increasing intergovernmental coordination to identify and combat violent crime within Indian lands and of Indians. So what this means is they wanted the government to talk to each other across departments and programs, and that's a lot harder than it sounds, but it's happening. First, it specifically directs the Department of Interior to designate an official within the Bureau of Indian Affairs to coordinate prevention efforts, grants, and programs related to missing Indians and the murder and human trafficking of Indians, because those can be separate and the same. Second, it charged DOI and the Department of Justice, or DOJ, with 2 responsibilities. 1, to establish the commission, and 2, to submit a written response. So the commission gets created, and then there's a response that that commission sends out. So what did this commission look like? Because how often have we heard of commissions happening, being established where we don't have a voice? We hear of that a lot, right? Well, this commission was different. It was the first of its kind that was congressionally created, advisory board, and it had federal and non-federal members. So there were people that applied that were leaders of tribal people, leaders of nonprofits, and even tribal leaders of their nations that sat on this commission. It was unique because it included representation from all of these factors: law enforcement, tribal leaders, federal partners, service providers, family members of missing and murdered individuals, and survivors of human trafficking. So you had all of these voices sitting at a table together. And then there were 6 topic areas that I'll talk about in a little bit that this entire group addressed, and also broke into subcommittees to address. And then 4th, the commission was charged with developing those recommendations for an intergovernmental coordination that would be best practices for state, tribal, and federal law enforcement for the epidemic of missing persons, murdered persons, and trafficked American Indian Native Alaskans. So how many people have heard of like the jurisdictional issues that can happen? We hear that word a lot. How many people are familiar with like what jurisdiction you're in right now? What would that be called? Did you have your hand up? No? Would this be state, federal, or tribal jurisdiction? State? Okay. If you're on a reservation, is it 100% sure that you're going to be on tribal jurisdiction? No, right. So it's messy and confusing a lot of times, especially for our border towns, on who has jurisdiction. But also that is not necessarily in the public health framework, but that's definitely something that leads to investigations and things getting a little bit messy with investigations. So that was a huge focus of this commission to talk about. So law enforcement and investigative resources was one commission. So they were identifying, responding to MMIP and trafficked persons. There were policies and programs subcommittee reporting and collecting data on MMIP and trafficked persons. Recruitment and retention of Tribal Bureau of Indian Affairs law enforcement. So there's a huge deficit of tribal law enforcement. We need more people going into the law enforcement field. And I'm sure we can all imagine why people don't want to do that in our tribal communities, right? It's a very, very difficult job, and they see some of the highest amounts of trauma. But that's something that we need to look at. Are we paying them equitably? You know, so all of those things were discussed in that commission. Resource coordination. So criminal jurisdiction, prosecution, information sharing, tribal, state, federal missing and murdered trafficked person investigations. So how were those investigations being coordinated across jurisdictions in a way that's functioning and that can work? Then there was victim and family resources and services. This is the subcommittee that I participated in. So advocacy, support, and resources for families and survivors of MMIP and human traffic victims. And then other legislative changes as necessary, because some of these things are much bigger and actually require legislative change. So the NIAC, the committee had hearings. They had 7 in-person field hearings all across the United States and into Alaska. And it used those hearings to inform the recommendations. And overall, almost 600 people attended the hearings, and 260 witnesses gave testimony to the commission. The commission came to Minneapolis when I was there, and before I was in the position I am now, and I also testified at the hearing. And I realized how emotional and difficult that is for families of survivors and survivors themselves to stand up to a commission and have to testify to that trauma, and it's that re-traumatization that happens. So there were major themes that came out of these hearings, including funding, accountability, returning jurisdiction to sovereigns, Alaska requiring tailored solutions because it is unique, data and coordination, communication, law enforcement shortages, the media's role, addressing vulnerabilities, trauma and resilience, and victim and family support. So as I said earlier, the report, the commission came together, wrote this report after many, many, many drafts, submitted it to DOJ, DOI, and Congress on November 1st, and then DOI and DOJ submitted a response back on March 5th. All of this is online, and no formal response was required by Health and Human Services, but we are definitely looking at all of the recommendations and filtering them through internal processes to see how we can respond to those in the best way possible. And most of the recommendations were really rooted in social and medical services, specifically prevention, intervention, healing, and response to violence and trauma. So how do we take care of people after they go through that trauma? What does that look like in our communities? So the conclusion is that the same thing we know, it requires the whole of government response, and even outside of government, it requires nonprofits, community members, it requires everyone to be involved. And we know that these recommendations are critical to an HHS and ACF specific response to the crisis. and an interagency approach is needed to effectuate lasting change. So if we're just in silos, and it's the same in our tribal organizations sometimes, it's the same in urban areas where we operate in silos and we aren't coming together with a comprehensive response plan. And this is a quote that came from the Not Invisible Act Commission. And I think this quote, I'm going to let you all read it, but you can really sense the urgency and the emotional response from the crisis that everyone was feeling. And if you can imagine being on this commission and sitting through hours and hours of testimony and then meetings talking about it, how exhausting and how that could physically, get into your body and how that felt to participate in that. I have a very high level of respect for everyone who served on that commission. I just came in, and served as an alternate at the very end. So I know there was an incredible amount of work that went into that from the federal and non-federal partners. So I'm very thankful for that. And so now I am going to open it up for questions, comments, basic conversation, if that's what you want. I know that was a ton of content and it was really heavy. So anything that stuck out to anyone? Oh, you don't have to clap yet. Was there anything that really stuck out to anyone as something new that you might not have known about? I know, I just have to tell you all. So on my way, I came in the room earlier and I get a call from my Aunt Dorothy. She's not gonna be watching this. So she calls me and she says, "Where are you? You're traveling all over the place all the time. Where are you?" And I said, "I'm in Tucson, Arizona." And I don't tell her what I'm doing, because I'm not gonna go into it. And she says, "Well, you better be careful. They're just taking people. They're just taking women if they're by themselves. You better be careful." And I said, "Well, I'm actually presenting at an MMIP symposium." But my grandmother was always the same way. They just really, and they would always be scared if I wore Indian clothes, out in mainstream communities, and I'd be a target for violence. So I just wanted to share that with all of you and make you laugh a little bit after you just ate some really amazing food and it's the afternoon. So I'll let you go ahead and ask your question or comment.
Wow, I loved your report. Read through it. Honor Collective, actually, as a group, we looked through everything you did. Wonderful, wonderful work. What's so exciting was this decade of healing. I would love to hear how you came to that. What would you envision? That's so wonderful. Can you talk more about that?
Yes, I don't know exactly where that is in the works, but if you saw in the MMIP action plan, embedding words of acknowledgement of harm might seem like a little bitty thing, but it's not. It's saying that we're actually acknowledging that these things happen to us and our families. And my grandmother isn't here to hear that. Or her parents, right, that experienced that trauma from boarding schools, but I'm hearing it, and we're acknowledging it from the government's acknowledging it, through ACF we're acknowledging it. And we're also acknowledging that this generational trauma is the reason why we're experiencing health crises in Indian country. So it's also saying, it's not that there's something wrong with you all as Indians, that you're always sick and all these things are wrong with you. It's saying, we've done something by creating these policies that have caused harm. So I see the decade of healing, how I would see it manifest if I could just have my vision, is that we would hear more about that. We would hear more acknowledgement from the top that these things have happened. We would see funding sources start to really structurally change, which I think we're starting to see the beginning of, because many of our tribal communities, when they apply for funding, whether it be BIA, self-governance, they might not receive all the funding they need. For the most part, they're not, right? So our communities are habitually underfunded, and then we try and seek out competitive grants to compensate for the lack of funding we receive in some areas. And so grants might seem like really boring stuff to talk about, but it's actually really, really important when you're looking at tribal administration. It's really, really important. It funds almost all of the people that work for your tribe in social services. It's funding your child welfare. It's funding your ICWA. We need that funding in our communities. It's funding TANF. It's funding LIHEAP so that people have propane in the wintertime, especially if you're up north where I'm at, that's a thing. And so when our tribes are applying for competitive, discretionary, meaning it might be there one year, it might not be there the next, funding for LIHEAP, for propane for their people, like we're talking about like life or death stuff, right? It's pretty serious. And so for us to really evaluate these grant-making processes and look at how we can fully fund tribes, which is what Executive Order 14112 is about, to me, that's life-changing for our communities. And it would alleviate so much of the administrative burden that our tribal leadership feels, our tribal administration, our finance department feels, that it would be able to allow us to do the work and not worry so much, and not to say the reporting won't happen, but the reporting could happen in a more culturally appropriate way that works for our communities. So that's what I would see in this decade of healing. I would see more funding for traditional healing practices, which might be complicated at first and chaotic, as most change is, right? Radical changes. But if we look at in this woman in this picture, right? This Danette woman, you see her, did she just go through her coming of age ceremony? And what does that mean for our communities to go through a coming of age ceremony? What does it mean for a young girl? My daughter was the first in 2 generations to go through that. And I watched her connect with the earth and creation in a way that, like, I still tear up thinking about it. She knows everything I know and way more at 12 years old. She knew everything I knew and more. And watching her go through that year, that cycle that she went through, I saw her be empowered, and also they become empowered in their bodies. It's a prevention and intervention tool. It's a protective factor. The same with birthing our babies. That you can do prevention there. Is there violence in the home? How do we intervene from a culturally specific standpoint? How do we intervene in a way that works for that family? That's how I see it. And I don't, I wish I could just, like, there's always theory and practice, right? And I realize there's a difference. And I always say I could write books on, like, the cures for everything, but in practice, it's always messier. But there are good results. I think that could happen. So I would like to see our language be reclaimed, our language be openly spoken whenever possible. I would like to see our babies on their boards. I would like to see young mothers loved and supported no matter where or how they came into that pregnancy. I would like to see our young boys being supported and loved. And know that they're valuable in our communities, and we need them. We need them. We need healthy families, Indian families. And that's not easy. And for anyone who's single in the audience, you know it's not easy. It's not easy. We need people that are sober. We need people that are culturally centered. We need people that are family oriented, to get back to those traditional roots. And that helps rebuild nations. That is nation building to me. And it starts with each of us. And it starts with reconnecting. You heard earlier, everything starts with us. And I feel like that even when I hear the word decolonization, I'm like, I don't understand that word because you can't decolonize this place. It's a colonial institution in its founding. You can't decolonize it. You can indigenize it, but you can't decolonize it. But what you can do is work on yourself, reconnect to the land, the water, the spirits, community, your relationships. We can do that. Each of us can do that. And we can watch how we treat each other. That's something else that I think all of us are human beings and we make mistakes, but we can watch with how we engage with one another in a good way and make relatives. Because that's what we do in Indian country. We make relatives. Like, who are you? Where are you from? That's the first things we ask, and that we don't lose that sense of who we are moving forward, I think. To me, that's a decade of healing. And that I can see my grandson and my granddaughters that are coming down the line, that they're going to remember who their grandma is and what she said and what she did. And they're going to be doing the same things that I wasn't allowed to do when I was little. That they openly carry that forward. That would be, to me, that would be magic. Anyone else? Are you all awake? I saw some of you sleeping. It's all right, though.
Anyone on this side have a question or comment? Over there? No?
Well, I'll be here this afternoon if anyone has any questions or if I can assist in any way. And just, Wiblahawangle, thank you all for listening to me. And I look forward to the rest of the conference. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Marisa.